A big thank you to Wei Chan, Jane and Lisa for that. We all definitely learned a lot, I'm sure. Just a quick reminder before we move on, please make sure you keep networking on our platform if you have access to it. It's a great opportunity, so don't waste it. And now I am very excited to introduce our next keynote panel as we shift our focus to net zero. As you can see, we are joined by some incredible leaders to walk us through the honest journey of decarbonization. So make sure you get your questions in as you have been all day long. And with that, I now eagerly hand over to Schneider Electric's Elin Olson to kick things off. Thank you, Elin.
Thank you, Alexia. And hi, everybody. Really excited to be here. So as mentioned, my name is Elin Olson. I'm a Senior Sustainability Consultancy Services Lead at Schneider Electric, and I'm very eager to be joined by three leaders in this field. So we're joined today by Joey Bergstein, the CEO of Seventh Generation. Many of you are already familiar, but this is a company whose mission is to transform the world into a healthy, sustainable, and equitable place for the next 7 generations, and offers plant-based home care and personal care products. I'm also joined by Julia Collins, who's the CEO and founder of Planet Forward. This is a company whose mission is to tackle climate change by making it easier for brands to bring climate-friendly products to the market, including software that will help make it simple for brands to reduce their carbon emissions in the food system and promote regenerative agricultural practices. And last but not least, I'm also joined by Elizabeth Sturcken, who is the head of the Net Zero Initiative for EDF+Business, including the development of the Transform to Net Zero Coalition in partnership with Microsoft. Prior to this role, she also led EDF supply chain team, including the development of the Supply Chain Solutions Center. So hello, everybody. Happy to be here. So I'd like everybody to just take a few minutes to talk about what they or their organization have done to regarding to net zero specifically. So I'll start out with Joey, and then we'll go to Julia and then Elizabeth.
Sure, thanks so much. You know, as we think about this, we're actually driving towards real zero. We don't want to stop at net zero. We don't believe that offsets are the solution for us. It's not good for the climate crisis that's in front of us. And we all need to push ourselves to go further than just the notion of net zero and really drive to an effective zero solution. We've set really clear goals ourselves, which would cut our greenhouse gas in scopes 1 through 3, inclusive of consumer use for us, by 50% by 2025. And we're aiming to cut it, by 80 to 90% by 2030. We have a science-based target that calls for that in order to limit reductions above to keep us above the 1.5 degree warming. The actions that we're taking as we think about what we need to do to drive to real zero starts inside of our business. So designing products that minimize our carbon footprint in mind. A great example of that is an ultra concentrated laundry detergent bottle that has the same number of loads as the big 100-ounce bottles, but is 70% lighter, it's 60% less plastic, it's 50% less water. And build a solution into the products. We're working on our operations and decarbonizing our ingredients, creating circular packaging solutions, using clean energy wherever we can. And then we impose an internal carbon tax that holds ourselves accountable to addressing the impact inside of our operations. And then addressing our broader footprint. What's really interesting in our business, I think anyways, I don't know, you can judge for yourself, but if you looked at our carbon footprint from the ingredients that are grown in the field through to the manufacturing, through the distribution, through to the usage when you and I are washing and drying our clothes at home and washing and drying our dishes at home, actually 89% of our carbon footprint happens at home. And so even if we got to the zero in our operations, it doesn't even come close to offsetting the total impact of our business. And so we've really thought about, okay, well, the answer for us is really, how do we go about helping transition the energy grid in our country to clean energy so that when we're drying, when we're turning on the washer, turning on the dryer, we're actually drawing from clean energy. And that's the work that we're putting into our advocacy programs. So those are the three things as we drive for real zero: designing products, working inside of our operations, and then really trying to advocate for a transition to a clean energy economy.
That's great, thank you. Julia, can you go next?
Yeah, I mean, I just have to first say, I think the work that Joey is leading at Seventh Generation is like a bright spot on the horizon. And I think we can all look to organizations like his for examples of how to really get the job done. At Planet Forward, we want to make it easier for brands to be able to create their own carbon neutral products and climate friendly supply chains. The way that we started actually was to create our own brand. We created a snack brand called Moonshot that was all about like the most incredibly efficient way to bring a product to market from a supply chain standpoint, from a sourcing standpoint, so that we could really drive toward real zero, not just net zero through offsetting. So we created a radically short supply chain for this cracker that we brought to market, where the wheat is grown 1 mile away from the miller and just 85 miles away from the baker. So what does it look like to really shorten your supply chains between the farm and the manufacturing center? We worked with farmers that were using the kinds of regenerative practices that help to restore the natural carbon cycle. So farmers that were using cover crops, reduced tillage, improving biodiversity, and really thinking about all of the ecosystem co-benefits that come as a result of this farming. So really thinking about sourcing. But I will tell you that the process of creating Moonshot was so challenging, and a lot of the work that we were doing on a first principles basis, really just figuring it out on our own. And that's why we decided to create this software product that allows other brands to do exactly what we're doing at Moonshot, a bit of what Joey's been doing at 7th Generation, with really deeply understanding your products, deeply understanding your footprint, and not just achieving zero through offsetting, but looking at all of the different interventions that you can make in your product cycle to reduce transportation distances, to sort of green the supply chain. And that's the work that we're doing for brands right now.
Super fascinating. Thank you. Elizabeth, can you go?
Sounds good. Yeah, EDF has been engaged in our work on net zero, specifically a report that we did last year with Deloitte on pathways to net zero, which looked at basically creating a roadmap for different sectors and industries on the way to net zero, specifically transportation and agriculture, and also looking at retail and technology. And basically came to the conclusion that companies need not just to focus on net zero, which is really what the planet needs to achieve by around mid-century, and is very different for a company versus the planet. Companies really do need the kind of shorter term science-based decarbonization goals, and setting those and having the plans. Certainly also one important area that we learned on the path to net zero was it's really important to focus on short-lived climate pollutants. We saw that with the news about a week ago about the importance of methane and addressing that very urgently. How we address that will make our path to net zero harder or easier, and also affect when we arrive at a stable climate. The other really urgent thing that we found on the path to net zero is that we together must really right now act to protect the world's current carbon stocks, in particular tropical forests. It's one of the most important things that we can do, and it's really outside of any one company's value chain. Finally, really incorporating just climate solutions for people of all genders, races, and skills. And it's just, if we don't have a just and equitable path, and we don't get there all together, we will not succeed, frankly. So we're producing a follow-up roadmap later this year, really focusing on the next 10 years, because what we have seen is companies are a little bit overwhelmed, even those who are leading in this journey. They just really don't know as much what to prioritize. So we're trying to help companies figure out what the most important things to do are. We're involved in a few collaborative efforts. You mentioned Transform to Net Zero, which is 9 companies and EDF, and with facilitation from Business for Social Responsibility. The whole idea there is you've got some leading companies trying to figure out how to get to net zero, helping other companies fast follow, and then doing the kind of systems change things that we need, like climate finance or public policy advocacy, to basically raise the floor for everyone else and bring everyone along. Also, it just a recently announced initiative, week before last, Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance. All of these things are really meant to supercharge action on the path to net zero, and bring everyone along.
That's fascinating. And what I see is connecting a lot of these responses is the need for a real net zero, and to make sure that we're taking a lot of interim steps along the way towards a longer term net zero. So with that, that means that many companies are going to have to prioritize both long-term as well as short-term goals and objectives. Can you speak to any goals that you might have that are maybe short-term and long-term, and how they might relate to each other, or where you see a lot of prioritization happening? Joey, I'll ask that to you first. You're also muted.
Oh, for crying out loud. You think I'd learned by now, right? Right. So, for the long term, and I think we've talked about short term and the short term actions we're taking in product design. For the long term, I think this really is about driving to a real zero. And we see lots of companies talking about net zero, and really do believe it's just not sufficient. We can't offset our carbon footprint. That's not a solution. There isn't enough space for all the trees we need to plant to be able to make good on all of those offsets, right? And so right now, if you want to be truthful, I don't think we have collectively a viable path. We don't ourselves, and I don't think the world does. I think we need to really work together and drive true systemic change. We need to see legislation put in place that keeps fossil fuels in the ground. We need to end support for subsidies for fossil fuel extraction. We need to transform this country's outdated petrol-intensive infrastructure and really embrace this moment that we're in as we work towards a recovery coming out of COVID, to invest in infrastructure that provides renewable energy for all, green buildings, clean transportation. And we need to drive a circular economy. We need to really invest in putting in places solutions that move us from single-use packaging and products to designing systems that reuse, recycle, and compost our resources. None of these things are short-term. These are all long-term in nature. And from our vantage point, I really think that business needs to take a real seat at the table and help drive the policy change that's needed to truly transform our economy through this shift that we need to put in front of us.
Thank you.
Elin, could I jump in on that? Do you mind? Joey, I really agree with you that we are not on the path. We are not where we need to be. When we think we need to reduce emissions by 50% in the next 10 years, we are far from where we need to be. And I just could not agree with you more about almost all of what you said there. The one thing I will take some strong exception to is the use of offsets or carbon credits. In our estimation and from what we have seen, we know that the use of high integrity, high quality carbon credits can really speed money to things like stopping tropical deforestation. And it's really not a substitute for companies decarbonizing their own operations and their own value change, right? That absolutely needs to happen. But it's not that needs to happen first, and then we take care of the forests or something like that, or then we invest in the technology we need to. Things need to happen together, right? And it's also not about planting trees, right? Because what we know is if you cut down a tree now, you've got 100 years before you've got a forest that can hold as much carbon. So it's really, there's been quite a bit of focus on planting trees, and that's not a bad thing, but Joey's right, there's not enough space. And really instead, what we really need to make sure is that what we do is, especially for tropical forests, that we support indigenous communities and livelihoods and make sure that those areas can thrive, and that we really stop cutting those trees down. So, and what we have seen is, in the short term, the use of high integrity carbon credits can really get a whole lot more climate impact. And I think for a hard to decarbonize sector like aviation, there is no other path in the short term. So I just don't want to keep that tool off the table. We really need to be doing everything and ramping it up in just a whole new way.
Yeah, let me be clear. I'm not saying we should be cutting down trees, quite the opposite. We really deeply believe in ensuring that we are sustainably sourcing, responsibly sourcing ingredients and materials that come from our forests. And, you know, that's not at all what I'm implying at all. What I'm trying to say is that if the only way to address our carbon footprint is through the purchase of offsets, I think it becomes, in many cases, an easy tool and keeps us from doing the hard work that we need to do inside our own businesses and the policy change that we need to see put in place to be able to really drive us to that kind of true zero economy. And so I agree. There's a time and there's a place for everything. But it's really important that we keep an eye on where are we making really meaningful change inside our own operations, you know, across the broader impact that we have as businesses.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that speaks really to the overall idea of we really need to reduce whenever we can, replace with sources like energy whenever possible and as fast as possible, and offset the rest is probably part of a longer term strategy for harder to abate emissions as we work here. But having as many tools in our toolbox is really to everyone's advantage. And speaking of tools in our toolbox, I think regenerative agriculture and our agricultural systems in general have tremendous capacity to absorb some of this. Julia, can you speak to some of the work that you're doing here and how you've been seeing the agricultural systems as part of a net zero journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's probably not a surprise to anybody who's listening and watching today that, you know, 25 to 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from land use and food systems. And I think we're all in agreement that there's no silver bullet solution to addressing the climate crisis, but certainly addressing our food systems is a really good place to start, or maybe a good quiver in our arsenal. So when we think about food systems reimagination, what we really want to be doing is converting our food cropland and even the calories that are produced on the ocean toward practices that can help to restore the natural carbon cycle. We talk about regenerative agriculture, but I should say that in many ways, regenerative agriculture is simply a return to indigenous principles of being connected to and being stewards of the land. And so often we think that we need to find new solutions, but really what we might do is harken back to these principles that are in place in indigenous communities globally, that are really good examples of how human beings can relate to our planet and relate to our resources. But with all of that said, regenerative agriculture is sort of the term of the day. And what we're talking about is really just a system of practices that help to restore the health of soil that's been degraded because of what we call conventional agriculture. And in the process of restoring these soils, we're also helping to trap carbon and sequester it in the ground, in the biomass, and also to create farm systems that are lower in emissions because they use fewer passes over the land or because they use a less heavy equipment. We also think about things like the introduction of cover crops and rotations. And so this is a really wonderful, scalable solution to using our food cropland as a lever in addressing the climate crisis. I think we talked a little bit about sort of market versus non-market strategy in the last section, but one of the things that needs to happen is not just increasing consumer interest in regenerative agriculture or encouraging brands to source from regenerative farmers. We really need to remove some of the structural impediments to adopting more regenerative practices. And so I'm looking at, in the United States, changes to the Farm Bill, changes to the way that crop insurance is administered to really remove those structural impediments and de-risk the proposition for farmers who want to implement these sorts of regenerative practices.
Yeah, that harkens back to a lot of the need for good policy to be able to support good business. So in terms of companies that might be looking to set net zero commitments, but might not necessarily feel that they can communicate this internally or might not be getting a lot of traction, or externally might have some concern about communicating this externally to either their stakeholders or the general public. Do you have any advice about the best practices for communication for companies looking to set net zero targets? I might start with you, Elizabeth.
And I'm gonna say something else first, if you don't mind, Elin, building off of what Julia and Joey were talking about, 2 points that I just really wanted to emphasize before I talk about the important question that you just asked. And that relates to science and policy. I just really want to emphasize that we really need to be science driven, right? Prove out, which of those regenerative practices actually drives carbon reduction. And to Julia's point, so many of these kind of ancient kind of systems approaches, they not only have climate benefits, but there are many co-benefits too. So, but we do want to make sure that if we're really thinking about trying to drive climate outcomes, that under the umbrella of regenerative ag, we are prioritizing those practices that actually, for which science proves out, they drive those greenhouse gas reduction benefits. And to both Julia and Joey's point, like the importance of policy just can't be underestimated. I think it's the single least used tool in the toolbox for companies. And, seventh generation is an exception here as a leader in terms of engaging in the public policy front. And we see a few other companies doing the same. But in truth, if companies really looked at climate change as an existential threat, they should prioritize their advocacy to follow, right? They should allocate money to it, prioritize it, advocate completely for it. And that is just really where we need to get. That is the new bar for corporate climate leadership, in my opinion. So to your point of how you communicate this, I think that Joey and Julia can maybe speak much better to this point. What we find is that if companies can figure out an aggressive yet achievable goal, long-term, but also with near-term milestones, and figure out a plan to do that, figure out where the business benefits are, because that's really important on this journey too. And then start to communicate about it in a really transparent way. The fact is, we still need a lot more transparency from companies in terms of their goals, how they're achieving their goals, and where are they having hurdles, right? Others need to learn from their mistakes and their successes.
That's a great point. Speaking to some of the communication internally or externally, Joey, did you have any hurdles externally or internally when communicating some of your goals?
Let me talk about the goal setting a little bit, just to build a little bit on what Elizabeth was saying, because I agree completely with the way that she's framing how you go about constructing this. I think the one additional thing that we've done, aside from being clear about what our footprint is, what's our aspiration in terms of how we want to address it, and then how do we get there in building an annual roadmap, is we also build that into our annual incentive program. So all of our employees have in their annual bonus, 20% of the bonus is based on delivering on our sustainability goals. Every one of our employees has that baked in. And it puts a real tension into the business, particularly as you get into the fourth quarter of the year. If you're behind on your sustainability goals, you're behind on your sales goals, which do you prioritize? And when there is money for everybody involved in delivering on both those things, those conversations take on a whole different kind of meaning. And we saw this last year. We were in a year where we were being able to serve about 50% of demand, and we're determined to deliver on our sustainability goals because it was built into everybody's compensation systems. And you make real trade-offs when you make that kind of commitment internally. I would say the other thing is the external communication of those commitments and the transparency. I think Elizabeth also spoke to that. We publish an annual sustainability report. We've been doing that for many, many years. And it's really transparent. We're not perfect. We missed a lot of our goals, but we pride ourselves in setting bold, ambitious goals that we think are where the industry should be heading, doing everything we can to hit those goals, and then transparently reporting on what it is that we're able to do. Most of our external communications are really focused, most of our external activities is focused on action. I think probably the additional piece that we do externally is the advocacy work that we were describing before, in really trying to invoke policy change, move, in the case of clean energy, move cities and states to make commitments to clean energy, but we've done the same around ingredient transparency, around chemical safety, taking on issues that we think are important to the industry, important to the world, and putting our money where our mouth is, and advocating for the change that we're trying to create. And for sure we could be doing more, but I think there also is a point of practicality when we, I was describing this laundry detergent bottle. that we've created. It's an amazing product, and if you try it, you'll never want to go back to the big bottles, because why would you want to carry a big 7-pound bottle if you could carry a bottle that's 1.5 pounds? It's just way easier to use, right? I'd love to be able to tell everybody that it's also good for their own personal carbon footprint. I'd love to also be able to tell people that it's great in cold water, and when you use cold water, you're using a lot less energy than when you use hot water. But at the end of the day, we live in a world of sound bites, and you really need to prioritize. And so you can't get all those nuanced messages out. I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we face, is really deciding what's the most important thing to get somebody to the right place.
Yeah, that's a great point, and also great laundry detergent, speaking from personal experience. But you mentioned a lot of these aspects of there are opportunities from branding for adopting these types of goals and really embedding it into your mission. Julia, can you speak to some of the maybe either expected or unexpected opportunities for companies who are looking to make this a way that they approach their business?
Yeah, I think, first I'd say that we're seeing just the way that people consume information and messaging has changed so dramatically in the last even 5 years. And although I do agree with Joey that in many ways we live in a world of sound bites, I actually do think that social media has created an opportunity for brands to engage more deeply with their customers. And there is a bit more time and space for more nuanced conversations. So the thing that I think can be delightfully surprising for brands is if they listen first and talk second. And before thinking about crafting the perfect, pithy, punchy soundbite message, listen to your stakeholders, listen to your customers. They will tell you where their minds are. They will tell you what they're ready to hear and that can sort of frame the conversation, and you can find your way in. When we look at the category, and again, I'm deeply, deeply focused on food, so you have to forgive me for always coming from this perspective, but 55% of the growth in CPG from 2015 to 2019 was related to sustainably marketed goods. So there's a huge wave of consumer interest in brands taking a stand. The strange thing is, no one knows exactly what sustainability means. There is no true definition. There is no aligned point of view on what it means to be sustainable. But perhaps this is an opportunity, because what a brand can do is define that term for itself. A brand can say, we're about diversity in our supply chains. We're about protecting our oceans. We're about decarbonizing our supply chains. And so in the absence of one single framework, what I think is really interesting for brands is to be able to lean into their brand DNA and craft their sustainability messaging according to their most important attributes. And I think they'll find that their consumers really resonate with that authentic point of view, as long as it's transparent, as long as it's credible, and as long as it's science-based.
That's really interesting, and I think a really key important thing to take forward is to listen first and then talk second when you're communicating out to your stakeholders or to your customers.
Elin, can I jump in on something?
Please.
Yeah, I'd like to point out that, every single company in truth really needs to be at the level where 7th Gen is right now, frankly, right? Every single product that is sold in a Walmart or a Target needs to be sustainable, right? Not just this one little green section of consumer products that, that I would buy. No, every single person, this is about democratizing sustainability, frankly, right? That's the only way we get to a climate stable planet where people can thrive, period. So it's really, it takes systems change, and it takes the kind of approach that frankly 7th Generation has taken here. I just want to point out how unique it is to have, internally in performance management systems, sustainability to be up there with the business metrics. And frankly, that is where we need to get to. Every single company needs to get to that point to drive the change that we need to see, frankly.
Can I just jump in and respond, because I totally agree with that point, Elizabeth. And one of the things that really excites us is, we never look at how do we grow our business by stealing from other green brands. We look at how do we change the marketplace. And the 7th Generation, we sold the business to Unilever about 4.5 years ago at this point in time. And when they first came to us, we weren't for sale. We were doing well, we were growing well, we had really patient investors. And yet what we realized as we looked at where we were was that when Unilever came calling on us, we saw that there are real values alignment between Seventh Generation and Unilever, and perhaps they're an exception also in the world of big multinationals. But we realized that we could go from having an impact on millions of people here in the US to potentially billions of people around the world. And one of the things that's been really exciting about being part of the Unilever family is just how they have taken on this mission. And the head of global home care last September for Unilever, they've got a 10 billion euro business around the world in what we would call very conventional home care businesses, the kind of businesses Elizabeth was just describing. And they've adopted what they've described as a Clean Futures agenda, which looks an awful lot like the Seventh Generation agenda. And that is the kind of change that we need to see across the industry. And I think we're seeing more and more of that. I mean, we're certainly feeling more and more and seeing more and more people coming into the space. And that's a great thing. I mean, it pushes companies like us to continue to innovate, to leap forward. And it's bringing more of the big players into the space that we all need to be in if we want to kind of create the change that we need to create as a society.
Yeah, I think the importance of having really concrete examples to show off, like, this works really well, this is really easy for us to understand. That is just such a huge thing for other companies to be able to actually take and adopt themselves to sort of spur that market change. I think one of the running themes that I've seen from all of you has been around some of the co-benefits around environmental sustainability. We've experienced several years of really deep change and disruption, and it's expected to really only continue. So can we speak to the co-benefits that we might see from addressing environmental issues that have other hopefully beneficial impacts on equity or indigenous rights or just general policy? Julia, I'll start with you first, since well, all of you have good opinions about this, but I'll start with you first.
Yeah, happy to kick it off. I mean, I spend a lot of time thinking about the intersection between social justice and climate justice, as does my team. And maybe I would argue that there is no social justice without climate justice. And it very much is the case that what we see in a warming climate disproportionately impacts Black and Brown communities, disproportionately impacts women and children. You know, when we think about mass migration because of desertification and all of the societal implications of those migrations. And so, you know, anything that we can do to address the climate crisis really does have a huge impact on communities who are already experiencing so many societal issues as a result of, you know, centuries of injustice. So that is part of what gets me really excited every day about doing the work that I'm doing. You know, sometimes we get so focused on carbon, right? And of course it's important. Of course that's an important goal. And it's a beautiful goal because it's so concrete, right? We can all understand what carbon is. But when we really expand our minds and think about all of the amazing co-benefits that happen, you know, when we're able to really address this climate crisis, what it means for communities, what it means for, you know, for organizations, what it means for biodiversity. I think that sort of expanded viewpoint is one of the things that gives me a lot of energy about this work.
That's great. Joey, can you speak to some of the things that you've seen with working with Seventh Generation?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Julia is saying around climate justice and the importance of supporting those who are affected first and worst by this climate crisis that's in front of us. One of the big things that we've done about 2 years ago, I think it was about 2 years ago, we made a commitment to, we have a foundation, a Seventh Generation Foundation. It's relatively small in the whole world of foundations, but we made a commitment that that at least 50% of the funds that come out of that foundation would be dedicated to Indigenous-led organizations that are working to lead us out of the climate crisis. So we're really trying to put money to work in support of those communities of color. We know that Indigenous nations in particular receive a very small fraction of charitable donations in the country, and we want to do what we can to ensure that they're well funded to be able to help lead us out of this climate crisis.
Fantastic. Elizabeth, do you have anything to add to that around some of EDF's positioning or things that they've seen around some of the co-benefits?
Yes, you know, EDF has been an organization that has been kind of very focused on the environment and prioritizing climate outcomes. And I think that the growth and transformation that we've undergone in the past few years is really just understanding what Julia and Joey have been saying about that it's must be done together, right? There is no, you know, no stable climate without bringing people along with it. And really, unless we address those impacts on poorer communities, Black and Brown communities, unless we prioritize that and remediate it and, you know, have that be front and center of what we're doing, we're just not going to get where we need to go. And so it's really a different reframing, and it's a waking up for all of us about the importance of you know, really what a stable climate looks like, a thriving planet, and you know, thriving people. It's just a real reframing, and it's been energizing, and it's daunting at times how far we have to go. But I think that it is energizing, and it's imperative.
Yes, huge problem to solve, but the benefits of solving it are significant and can be realized across nations, across people. So I think it's, you know, it drives everyone here and to do what we're trying to do. So I'm going to try to go to some of the questions from the audience here. One of the first ones was, how do you identify and evaluate opportunities for improving sustainability? And specifically, how do you decide what goes into a decarbonization roadmap? Does anyone have any advice for this question? Elizabeth or Joey, I think maybe having come up with a roadmap yourself, you might be able to speak to this.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. I think it starts with understanding what your carbon footprint is first and foremost. Where are the biggest impacts in the value chain, and identifying where can you find alternative solutions to be able to go and address it. And so for us, I mean, one of the biggest ahas was what I was describing on consumer use, you know, and then figuring out, okay, well, what do you do about that? And we've come up with a solution, whether it's a perfect solution or not, who knows, but at least it's a solution. And you know, other areas we've looked at is packaging, our ingredient footprint. It's really just, it's understanding it, breaking it down, and then identifying, okay, well, what can you do? And pacing it out over time. None of this stuff happens easily. We're all on a journey. You know, I appreciate, you know, the appreciation for 7th generation in the call, but, you know, we're far from perfect. We've got a lot of work that we need to do ourselves. And we're constantly, you know, trying to identify how do we continue to do better and better, and setting goals that push us, but that we can achieve. And so I think it's just the hard work of understanding and then determining where you can make an impact.
That's really helpful. There's a question specifically for Elizabeth. What are your thoughts on sustainable forestry providing benefits to forest communities in tropical areas and elsewhere?
Yeah, similar to what we were just talking about, I think that, you know, unless we take care of the forest communities and the indigenous peoples of this world, we just won't succeed. You know, there's no path forward where ripping down forests and hurting indigenous people is going to work. We're not going to get to where we need to go. And, you know, it is super challenging with some of the governments in tropical forest countries that are prioritizing, you know, extraction from the land instead of thinking about the benefits of, you know, forest preservation for livelihoods, for climate. So this is a super challenging issue, but one that, you know, we must prioritize on the path forward.
There's another question I think that is will be definitely interesting for the panel. Can you clarify why are we looking for a business solution to a public crisis?
Can you say that again, Elin?
Sure, sorry, I might have mumbled a little bit. Can you clarify why we were looking for a business solution to a public crisis? So this was specifically around, how innovation sits with private enterprise, and most companies are working to sustainably manage forests aren't able to generate short-term profits. So I think this is specifically around forestry. Sorry.
It is around forestry or not? No.
I think you can speak to the broader question too.
Well, maybe I'll speak to that a little personally, because I would say that, I started off in my career at EDF over 20 years ago doing corporate partnerships, and I just never thought I'd still be doing this work. I just thought, we'd prove out the win-win, the business win, environmental win, companies would just get it and do it, or, government actors would step up. And, the truth is we haven't, right? Like what we have seen from, for example, the past 4 years in the US on a national scale, right? The federal government was absent. Not only were they absent, they were taking us in the exact wrong direction, right? They were ripping down our environmental foundation. So during that time, I think all of us who work with companies were holding our breath, like are the companies going to start to go backwards? And some of them did, but many of them stepped forward more aggressively, even so. And I think what I am starting to see is, again, all of it is needed, right? Like, yeah, I mean, it would be great if that was, if company leadership wasn't needed, if we didn't need to rely on the private sector as much, right? There's a reason. There's a good reason for public policy and the collaborative effort that it takes to bring good public policy to the fore. When we exist, as we do in the United States, in this very partisan environment, I think we need companies to lead and show the way. There's really a very narrow window of time here for climate that we need to act, right? And we need to act really urgently and really transform what we're doing. Do I think business alone and voluntary business action is going to get us there? No, it's not. We need public sector also, but we definitely do need business leadership.
I agree with that. We need both. We need both. I mean, companies can't continue to externalize their impacts into the world around us. We need companies to take accountability for the pollution that they create, to keep it in simple language. At the same time, we need public policy. And ideally you've got a collaboration between, there's a public-private partnership that works hand in hand together, but it's not one or the other. It's absolutely a combination of the two things that's needed for us to be able to lead our way out of the crisis that we're faced with at this moment.
Definitely, I think it's all hands on deck, right? Public, it's private, it's really consumers, it's everybody who can move us forward, and they can possibly do it. We need to have them with us. So in some of the final moments here, I'd like to talk through any advice that you might have, being an expert in this field, around what some of the best foot forward might be for those who are considering to either continue on a net zero journey or who are planning on starting one. Julia, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I think for people who are interested in beginning their net zero journey, it really begins with understanding where you are right now. You need to deeply understand your carbon footprint, not just in an economic modeling sort of framework, but you need to deeply understand your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and really understand where they're coming from. Before you can take action, you first have to measure.
Joey, why don't you go next?
Sure. Again, totally agree that it starts with measurement. I really do think this is about real zero and companies taking accountability for driving themselves to zero, and absolutely thinking holistically through consumer use. And then finally, I think if I were to do one thing in addition to the measure and take impact, it's building in internal mechanisms that get everybody in the company vested in making the change that we need to make. And it's easy in a company like 7th Generation, you would think, where people are here because of our mission and our values and the change that we're trying to create in the world. But at the end of the day, everybody takes home a paycheck. And when you tie that change into the way that we compensate people, it makes really meaningful change.
I guess I would say companies need to set the long-term goal, be it a net zero goal,
That's an excellent call for action for everyone. Just measure, do what you can, start on the journey, and know that you'll need to iterate along the way.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Elin. I completely agree with all of that. And thanks so much to all of you, Joey, Julia, Elizabeth, really discerning perspective on our journey to net zero, real zero, and definitely has given us a lot of food for thought. Thank you so much for that. We are lucky enough to have had Schneider Electric as a partner this year, so do check out all of Schneider Electric's latest work on our partner hub and be sure to connect with them directly to find out ways of how to work alongside them at this important time in your energy transition. Well, we've already found ourselves at another 10-minute break, and I'm so grateful for everyone who has joined so far and got your questions in, as well as all of our speakers that we've heard from and the sponsors that have contributed up to now. So for the time being, grab a coffee, answer that email that's been in your inbox, and make sure that you do come back for 2:15 p.m. ET for the rest of this afternoon sessions. Once again, that's 2:15 p.m. See you then.